When historians recount the year 1917 in Halifax, their focus typically remains on the devastation above ground, the massive explosion, the 2,000 lives lost, the 9,000 injured, the entire neighbourhoods reduced to splinters and ash. But the real story, the one that barely surfaced in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in maritime archives, began below the harbour. It started with a simple rescue operation. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the obliterated north end, stabilise what remained of the waterfront, and determine whether the shattered ground could support rebuilding efforts. The goal was practical. Remove the wreckage, assess structural damage, and prepare for reconstruction. But the moment workers began excavating through the blast zone, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in generations. Beneath the harbour district, deeper than any known foundation reached, the crews found chambers and passageways that didn't match colonial construction records. Their orientation was unusual, their depth was remarkable, and the stonework didn't resemble anything in the architectural catalogues of British North America. It didn't even resemble typical maritime engineering as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in official relief reports. It didn't make it into newspapers documenting Halifax's resilience. But in the internal documentation of that year, a specific phrase appears repeatedly. Unforeseen infrastructure, unexpected depth, origin unclear. The official story would later simplify all of this into old storage vaults, abandoned smuggling tunnels, or simply misidentified colonial remnants. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in makeshift darkrooms while Halifax rebuilt itself, show something different. They show workers standing beside stone passages cut with precision far superior to any colonial-era tool should allow. Tunnel segments fitted together so seamlessly that even in the grainy quality of 1917 photography, no construction joints are visible. Channel systems carved into bedrock that bear no resemblance to any documented maritime infrastructure, but something older, more sophisticated, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like colonial history as we know it, and more like infrastructure that had been utilised, abandoned, and purposefully concealed. The search for explanations. At first, the recovery teams tried to categorise everything in the simplest way possible. Abandoned cellars, forgotten storage tunnels, natural limestone formations created by water erosion. But as documentation accumulated and more passages were uncovered, the contradictions multiplied. Why were certain underground structures built with load-bearing capacity far exceeding anything that stood above them? Why were particular stone blocks shaped in near-uniform dimensions, as if manufactured, rather than hand-cut? Why did some corridors extend into darkness far beyond the boundaries of any recorded settlement? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers, why were these structures so extensive? Halifax in 1917 was a modest port city. Yet the subterranean network beneath parts of the harbour district appeared designed for something vastly larger than warehouses and merchant buildings. Recovery crews quietly acknowledged among themselves that the scale and precision didn't align with any colonial or pre-colonial records. And although none of them were using terms like forgotten civilizations, they were recognising something equally disturbing. Someone had built beneath this ground before. Not simple storage, not smuggling routes, infrastructure. The growing silence. As the records multiplied, so did the quiet. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the broadest perspectives of the discoveries. And then the excavation sites were partially sealed again in late 1918, backfilled where necessary for reconstruction, and much of what had been exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments survive, documentation, several photographs, and the subdued accounts of archivists who examined the files before some vanished. But even from what endures, a pattern becomes visible. Passages too uniform for any documented colonial settlement, stonework too precise for the accepted timeline. construction techniques that appear inherited, foundations that seem to belong to an entirely different building era. The layers beneath the harbour, when the recovery crews advanced past the initial recognisable strata beneath Halifax's north end, the assumptions were straightforward. They anticipated discovering natural bedrock, perhaps some abandoned colonial construction, and scattered debris from early settlement. Nothing peculiar, nothing exceptional. But within weeks that premise disintegrated because instead of a clear progression of geological and historical layers, the crews unearthed a succession of architectural strata that didn't function the way layers of an ordinary coastal settlement are meant to function. The directional anomaly. The initial anomaly was orientation. Each layer, colonial, pre-colonial, and whatever existed beneath, appeared to maintain the same directional bearing, the same angles, the same geometric framework. Different periods shouldn't exhibit that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades or centuries. They don't construct in flawless alignment with structures built generations apart. Yet beneath Halifax waterfront they did. Chambers from one period positioned precisely above chambers from another. Passages aligned with passages buried meters beneath them. Structural walls maintained the same trajectory even when separated by indeterminate decades. It was as though every group that ever constructed on this ground was following an original design, one that no longer appears in any historical documentation. Engineering beyond the timeline. As the labourers dug deeper, the strata grew more peculiar. Below the anticipated bedrock and colonial foundations, they started finding stonework that resembled nothing like typical construction. Substantially larger blocks, considerably tighter connections, configurations that appeared too geometrically precise for anything in Halifax's recorded chronology. Certain chambers looked nearly excessive, vaulted spaces with perfect curvature, executed with an accuracy that didn't correspond to the primitive implements of colonial-era builders. Water management systems. And then arrived the finding that confused even the most traditional members of the engineering examination team. Sophisticated water management infrastructure, channel systems with precision grading, drainage mechanisms with pressure-rated construction, reservoir chambers with flow control features. Yet there exists no historical documentation of Halifax ever possessing such advanced hydraulic engineering in the colonial period. No charts indicating complex water systems below these particular locations. Nothing that accounts for why substantial portions of the deepest infrastructure appear designed for water management far beyond simple drainage or storage. Recovery images captured in 1917 and 1918 demonstrate this unmistakably. Labourers positioned beside channels so precisely cut that the men appear crude by comparison. Stone conduits carved so accurately that even contemporary civil engineers examine the archival photographs in amazement. Gradients and connections that mirror modern infrastructure far more than anything colonial Halifax is attributed with. What didn't appear in the archives. But the most troubling detail was not what surfaced in the photographs. It was what failed to surface in the official records. The authorized reports composed in the years following the recovery scarcely reference these characteristics. Certain illustrations exclude the deepest passages altogether. Particular layers of infrastructure are condensed within definite terminology like earlier foundations or natural formations, even though the photographs demonstrate they were far more intricate than that. The silence is difficult to overlook. Because if these lower strata genuinely belong to recognized historical periods, why weren't they portrayed in detail? Why weren't the exceptional construction methods recorded thoroughly? Why were the photographs dispersed across maritime repositories instead of compiled into a single federal document? Even certain stone surfaces presented a concern. Edges too precise, channels too uniform, marks that appeared less like hand-cutting and more like precision work. Work that, based on the conventional chronology, didn't exist when those passages were presumably constructed. the infrastructure that shouldn't exist. What the recovery crews revealed were structures that didn't correspond to British colonial construction, didn't correspond to French settlement patterns, and didn't even correspond to one another in conventional terms. Instead, they constituted a peculiar engineering vocabulary, one that appeared to originate from multiple periods yet somehow remained cohesive, oriented, and impossibly exact. Geometrically perfect chambers. The initial surprise arrived with the chambers themselves. These weren't primitive storage cellars or confined cave networks. They were geometrically precise spaces, chambers shaped with exact proportions, arches that preserved their curve impeccably, and stone vaults arranged with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master plan that no longer exists in any repository. Certain chambers were sealed entirely, packed with blast debris so compact that labourers assumed they had reached natural bedrock. But once breached, they disclosed interiors that appeared undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Refined walls, assembled stone, and construction configurations that generated more mysteries than solutions. Massive circular stone structures. And then arrived the characteristic that still confounds researchers presently: the massive circular stone structures. Formerly, they were subsequently identified as old cisterns or storage wells, but nothing about them corresponds to characteristic colonial engineering or rudimentary water storage. These were too balanced, too deep, and too flawlessly circular, as though they were carved with implements capable of sustaining perfect curvature. Certain structures were broad enough for several men to occupy inside, others contained internal features that suggested mechanical purposes. Labourers from 1917 characterised them in personal correspondence as engineered vessels, not wells but constructions with a specific function, though nobody could specify what that function could have been. Anomalous load-bearing design. Another peculiarity emerged in the construction of certain support systems. These were not merely basic colonial foundations. Many were designed with load-bearing capacity that made no architectural sense for the modest buildings that had stood above them. It generated an unsettling possibility. The waterfront structures may not merely rest on natural bedrock, they may rest on something substantially larger, an infrastructure whose dimensions were never documented, never taught, and never clarified in the authorized history of Halifax. Metal embedded in ancient stone. The further the labourers excavated, the more peculiar the discoveries became. Stone blocks emerged with completely straight boundaries. Certain surfaces were refined, almost polished. Others displayed precision-carved channels so clean that contemporary stonemasons still debate about what implements could have created them. But the finding that produced the most bewilderment was the metal incorporated inside ancient stonework. Certain fragments appeared fused, oxidized in patterns that suggested extreme heat, yet they were located in strata presumably predating any metallurgy sophisticated enough to generate such results. The authorized explanation provided subsequently: ship debris from the explosion, colonial metal fittings. But that does not account for why the metal emerges inside the stones in patterns, not randomly scattered but positioned, organized, as though the stone was shaped around it. That variety of result demands temperatures far exceeding typical forge work, far exceeding colonial metalworking, and far exceeding anything documented in maritime history. The organized underground network. Shortly following these findings, something peculiar started occurring. Chambers were resealed, passages were backfilled, deep portions of the locations were isolated from continued excavation. Certain of this was formally designated as structural safety matters necessary to stabilize the devastated waterfront. But the choices about which chambers to reseal first and which sections to interpermanently generated subdued questions among witnesses, because the passages that were closed promptly were invariably the ones that contested the authorized chronology the most. The flawlessly carved structures, the sophisticated water management systems, the unusual metal inclusions, the engineered passages that appeared to extend far beyond the excavation area. These passages were possibly the most enigmatic discovery of all. They weren't haphazard tunnels. They were components of a systematic configuration, a network of corridors that appeared less like storage and more like infrastructure. Oriented, calculated, organized as though they once connected to a substantially larger subterranean system, one that stretched below the harbour long before any settlement we recognize ever occupied the surface. And yet, almost as quickly as they were revealed, many were resealed. Their openings obstructed, their purpose unexplored, their presence quietly eliminated from later reconstruction charts. The deliberate stopping. When you examine the concluding months of the 1917 to 1918 recovery operations, something becomes impossible to disregard. The initiatives didn't conclude, they were halted, not finalized, not terminated, halted. The further the recovery crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation transformed. Initial entries were assured almost procedural, but by the conclusion the language becomes guarded, indefinite and oddly incomplete, as though someone else abruptly controlled what could be recorded. The final chambers, and this is where the ultimate mystery commences. Because the final chambers they accessed beneath Halifax's waterfront weren't typical, they weren't geological, they weren't colonial remnants, they weren't even classifiable. They were something else altogether. Multiple accounts, the few that persisted, portrayed stonework that abruptly transformed from the recognizable to the inexplicable. Walls with connections so tight you couldn't insert a blade between them. Curved passages formed with accuracy that colonial-era Halifax was never meant to possess. Platforms engineered for purposes far beyond anything recorded above them, and corridors that stretched beyond the excavation area, vanishing into darkness below the rebuilt city. The reburial. But here's the aspect that always gets concealed. The most sophisticated chambers were the ones that were reinterred first. Labourers described refilling complete passages, closing entrances, packing soil into spaces that had just been revealed. It wasn't gradual, it was prompt, the authorised explanation, geological volatility, safety matters, reconstruction priorities. But if it was solely about safety, why were the most ancient, pristine, most structurally flawless chambers the ones resealed first? And why were the most unstable, blast-damaged areas left accessible for recording? It doesn't make logic unless those lower strata posed a different variety of danger, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the foundations below Halifax's waterfront genuinely displayed construction methods beyond colonial capacity, and if certain of those chambers didn't correspond to any documented settlement at all, then the complete accepted narrative of maritime Canadian history starts to crumble. The unanswered questions. Imagine what it would signify if a modern harbour city were constructed on top of something far more ancient, something massive, something manufactured, something we didn't construct. Imagine what it signifies if the foundations weren't natural developments, but intentional attempts by subsequent peoples to conceal or repurpose what preceded. And perhaps that is why the 1917 findings were quietly reinterred, not to safeguard the locations, but to safeguard the narrative. The remaining photographs convey their own narrative. Labourers positioned next to passages that appear almost modern, channel systems too consistent for their presumed age, infrastructure too sophisticated for colonial-era engineering. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to clarify. They're the varieties they prefer not to discuss at all. The final question. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest construction, the most sophisticated infrastructure sealed away again? Because when you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The flawless stonework was interred, the peculiar circular structures were interred, the inexplicable passages were interred, the sophisticated water systems were interred, The embedded metal components were interred, and even portions of the photographic documentation vanished, almost as though the recovery had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of history that wasn't meant to emerge. A chapter more ancient than British settlement, more ancient than French colonization, more ancient than the narrative we were provided. And for one brief instant in 1917, the explosion opened the ground sufficiently to reveal it. But rather than examining it, they closed it again, sealed it, backfilled it, forgot it, or feigned to. Because if Halifax stands on top of structures erected by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the genuine question is not what was revealed in 1917. It's what else remains beneath the harbour cities of the world. What other ports, what other waterfronts, what other coastal settlements were quietly reinterred long before cameras existed? The 1917 Halifax excavation wasn't merely a recovery operation. It was a glimpse, a brief inadvertent glimpse, into a version of history we were never intended to witness.